welcome to my session for Adobe DITA World 2022, and the session is it safe to mention DITA in polite society? Goodness me, what do I mean by that? Today I'm going to just cover a few ideas around some of the analogies you might use for DITA, and some things that we really do feel are important that we need to be sharing and talking to our senior managers. And don't lose your head, which will make sense as we go through some of the slides. But first of all, who am I? My name's Julian Murfitt. I work for a company called Mekon. In fact, I started the company with my brother back in 1990. So half of my life has been working in the create, manage and deliver sector. And that's really started out with FrameMaker, actually FrameMaker 3, running through to now AEM guides in 2022. But if I'm not working, actually you might find me upside down flying aircraft, or more recently, less of the competitions and actually teaching people how to safely fly inverted. So that's really my passion, if we can get away from work from time to time. So what are we talking about today? Well, it's a communication issue, I think. And the first question then is, who are we communicating with? And I think it's the senior management. This is not our customers I'm talking about. This is who we as people in the technical communications sector or departments, who are we communicating to, and who are we trying to convince? And that's, senior managers, engineers. And they can be scared off with some of the technical detail. And certainly they're impressed by shiny toys. So what's new? What's a trend? And they can be influenced by maybe some of the non-believers and those that are ignorant about the sort of world we live in this DITA space. So we need to be careful not to scare the horses. But they all like a story. And this starts with the XML piece. XML is the start of the scare. And a good story around this, I think, is one from a friend of mine, Noel Zabina. And he was saying that one of his friends said, you talking to a chap who was a JSON developer, said, you must meet Noz. He's into XML. And that's similar to you, right? And to which he said, XML? Does he drive a car where he puts his feet through the floor and pushes himself along? Well, I think that's a pretty unfair thought if you're into XML that you would do that. And I think this is a bit of JSON developer snobbery and actually a bit of ignorance of what really XML is about. And I would say that we should think about XML as just a form of communication, a bit like the written word. So think as XML is how we communicate in a way that we speak and use words, the written page, where we join a bunch of letters together. And when we join them in the right way, they make words that we understand, okay? A language. And we have rules that allow us to communicate those words. And that might be, therefore, the Rosetta Stone is more akin to XML than the Flintstones. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you think of JSON, that's lightweight interchange format, okay? Doesn't do semantics, though, so well. And it's not really designed for metadata, but it is simple to understand. And it's great for the web and JavaScript and things like that. So, it's a great language. Whereas XML is another language, I would see JSON as a bit more like emojis. It's a good, simple way to communicate. But it lacks some of the finesse. And so you can get quite a lot across in a very quick way. Well, if we look at DITA and say, okay, XML is this written communication. If we then think DITA, we can consider that like a language. So if we were talking in French or English or German. And so I'm thinking it's a set of rules that say if you join these letters up in a certain order, you'll make words that follow those rules and sentences that follow those rules. And then we have a language. And therefore, I can think of French being DITA, and therefore S1000D is another XML standard that maybe like English. The two are not directly compatible, but they might have similarities, like table or une table is actually a different way of pronouncing the same word, same set of letters joined together, but actually they're done in a subtly different way. So that's quite a nice way to explain that. First of all, we have XML, then we have DITA, which is a flavor of XML, which is a set of rules around that. So if we take that another step further, you might have heard Lego being used to describe DITA. In fact, there are a number of people that have used this in presentations, so I'm certainly not leading the way with this. But I do like it as a way to describe DITA, because people like Noz and have done presentations, and Soren you may have seen, a number of people have done this. And essentially what we're saying is that Lego forms little blocks. What I like about this is that each one of these blocks that you can see on the screen here are created to a very specific specification, and that specification allows them all to join and interplay with each other. And if they didn't follow the specification, then they wouldn't plug in. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Right. And so then you can join those pieces. As long as you write your content using those rules, we can then collect them together and then tell stories. And we can use those same blocks, those same pieces, and reorganize them, rearrange them, and we can tell a different story. But don't be thinking that that means you can't do things like JSON, because actually you could produce the JSON just as easily, because actually that's a dumbing down. You can have a simple block form that you might have that JSON supports, that still can then be used in other ways. So actually to suggest that JSON is more sophisticated is somewhat incorrect. In fact, it's not somewhat, it's completely incorrect. And XML is actually more powerful. So let's explore that a little further. The only thing I'd say about DITA, though, is that there is a notion that you migrate to DITA. And I don't think we should be saying that. If you consider something that migrates, a bird, it moves from one country to another, a place that perhaps is warmer, where there's more food available. And when it gets there, it's a little tired and it's a little thirsty, but it's still a bird. Whereas, in fact, when you migrate to DITA, you're actually doing a metamorphic change. You're moving to a completely different thing. And it's quite nice if you think about the metamorphic vision that you see on the screen, that you're moving from this caterpillar, this wobbling around, munching away, all of this content in an old, unstructured way. And then it turns into this beautiful butterfly that is much more mobile and free to fly. And so I think it's quite a nice metaphor or maybe analogy to say that DITA. But it does mean that we have to go through a lot of energy to make that move. And there are other phrases that are coming up these days that I wanted to touch on because it's really what is important. Content operations, you'll hear. And content operations is nice because it's really saying it's a new way to perhaps describe what we used to say as create, manage, deliver. It's more than that, I'm sure. And it covers other silos and touches other points within the business. But essentially, it's not conflicting with our world of DITA. It actually could be used within that context, and that's fine. Content as a service, perhaps, is another thing. I don't think that's a big change, but it's a new way to say that we are actually serving content, and there are maybe APIs and tools that we use to do that. But then you start touching into the headless CMS area, and I'm going to come back to headless CMS because this is a little bit of a bone of contention for me. Semantic modeling, now that is a big thing, and a lot of people, it's not new, but it's certainly something that we talk a lot about in this documentation world. I didn't hear anyone talking about semantic modeling back in the old desktop publishing days in the 80s, but now we certainly are talking about that. So it's not a new concept, but it's new in our space. And knowledge graphs. and building a better and more comprehensive relationship of different pieces of information and how they interrelate to each other is big. And because of that, we might talk about taxonomy in a moment. But virtual reality, blended reality, these are new things that we're needing to deal with. And so we definitely need to understand them and how they work with our in our world, maybe in XML and DITA. And the digital twin, well, I must say the digital twin is definitely not new, although it's being talked about now as if it's a new thing. Being in the aviation industry, I can tell you that digital twins have been around a long time. All aircraft have simulators. The Wright brothers perhaps didn't have a simulator for their aircraft, but certainly now all modern aircraft have simulators, so you can train, and trial them early. So it's not a new concept. But tech writers, this is an interesting one because I've noticed that the idea of tech writers is changing. Are they still around? And if you know, Keith Schengili-Roberts writes a blog, and he noticed that since 2012, there's been a slow decline in the number of job adverts being posted for technical writers, and therefore you might wonder what is going on there. And I don't think that's because there are less technical writers in the world. In fact, there is a need and possibly more awareness of the fact that they are vital in the whole communication to our customers. So where have they gone? Well, I think they just renamed themselves. They're being called content engineers, information designers, and I'm sure you can think of some others. Do post some other things that you think you're being called now in this industry. And so then you might go, well, where's the yacht rock coming from? Well, yacht rock is another example of this new name for an old thing. If you've never heard of it, go and Google yacht rock. It's a genre which actually was coined in about 2005. And yet actually it describes music like Steely Dan from back in the 70s and 80s. So it's an old music, but replayed with a new description of the genre. And now it's got a new kind of a new surge of interest. And so I like the idea that we are using new phrases to describe things, even though it's still the same job. Omnichannel is a bit like this for me, although I would be lambasted probably by the Omnichannel X conference to say, oh, it's a lot more than that. And I would agree that there is more to Omnichannel than just multi-channel on steroids. And yet, actually, it's not a bad way to describe it, because we are talking about delivering content to multiple channels. Yes, maybe for subtly different reasons. And do you know what? Omnichannel is another step forward, but many companies are still challenged and trying to get their head around just the omnichannel bit. The multi-channel bit. And that means they're still trying to get the information consistent. And one of the issues about consistency is this semantics that I was talking about earlier. And this, therefore, is a word that we do need to get our head around and be comfortable with talking about. And it crosses all the boundaries, whether you're a headless, whether you're a web CMS, whether you're a DITA CMS, whether you're working with XML or JSON. You do need to be looking at semantics. And the reason for this is really what gives the intelligence to the content so that computers can read and understand and interpret that information more so than we can as, certainly the humans can do that already. Computers are not very good at it. And if you've got unstructured content, then sure, you need to use NLP, natural language processing, artificial intelligence. And yes, you can then use tools like Pool Party that do this very well. But actually, if you've got structure, you can still use Pool Party. And this is where enterprise taxonomy comes in. Enterprise taxonomy is going to help you with that search. And it's really about getting consistency in your language. A little bit on the taxonomy is it's about getting consistent values for the metadata that you're using. And you can see this taxonomy layer in this diagram that was created by Judy Verno some years ago. And it's feeding into the metadata layer, which then feeds into your platforms that you're using to distribute the content. And so if we have a consistent set of terms, then we're going to get better search and more consistent search. But also synonyms and maybe polyhierarchical terms. And these are the things that are going to really make a difference. And so this is a good area to say, to be comfortable, that taxonomy, regardless of the sort of technology that we're working with, is actually important. And there are tools, as I say, like Pool Party, that will help us do that. So let's move to this headless thing. Headless CMSs, in many ways, have been around for years, but they've got a new renaissance, and it's a bit like the electric car. First invented in 1839, very interesting during the 1900s, because petroleum, gasoline, was actually in real short demand, short supply, and therefore you couldn't get a hold of it. And the idea of the electric car looked really good, but it was expensive, and the technology wasn't really there. And I think this is like headless. In fact, headless went away for a while when the web CMS came of age, because it was the web that we were feeding. So why not have a system that directly fed that CMS and that website, and the web was our main driver. But then we started to realize that we needed many more formats and outputs. And so actually the headless CMS came back. And so what actually is a headless CMS? Well, it's a container, a content management system that allows you to separate content from form. Interesting. I've heard that before. And actually it allows you to arrange content in blocks. These blocks are not quite as sophisticated as topics that you do in XML, but they are nonetheless blocks that you can, if you model it correctly and create your own set of models, that you can actually create quite a sophisticated structure. And then you can use APIs, REST APIs, to create any output that you like. So you have a toolkit of way of carving that word up so that you can deliver it appropriately. Okay, so if you have those skills, then you can indeed also tell a story. And that story, maybe I don't think as sophisticated, I'm a little bit mean here with my little story picture there. But actually, yes, you can build the story, but there are no standards. And you've got to build the information model in order to be able to structure that. So actually sharing that content with other people is not quite so easy as you might think. It's an exchange language, and so at the very basic level, it's very easy to exchange. But unless you exchange some of the information model with it, then actually, what are you exchanging? Whereas with DITA, we have a really sophisticated exchange language and a really great architecture. So I'm not so convinced that headless is better. And it's certainly not as semantically as capable. But wait a minute. DITA and the concept of DITA CMS, what is that exactly? And in fact, if we look at that, it is a place where we can store content in blocks, or topics as we would call them, and it is more semantically rich, and it does separate content from form, and it actually allows us to publish to multiple channels. And it has an architecture that is already there and is very capable for evolution. And actually, you can save it, output it to JSON. So where's the problem? And why aren't we thinking, when people say, oh, we need a headless CMS, why aren't we saying, well, yeah, we have a DITA CMS, and that is pretty headless, right? It allows us to have quite a lot of flexibility. And it's as more powerful than some of the traditional headless CMS that use maybe DocBook or Markdown. It's only a shame that lightweight DITA is not being used in some of these headless CMSs, and then maybe we would have less of a challenge. And that nicely brings us on to AEM guides, which you'll now know is the new name for the XML capable addition to the AEM suite. And AEM guides is a very powerful, fully capable DITA CMS. And that means it actually is providing us the basic architecture for a headless CMS. And it allows us to plug it into AEM sites, which means we have really good access to an AEM, a web architecture. And it also allows us to publish it to many other different formats because of the open toolkit and the capability that that gives us. So I quite like the idea that it's a bit like a headless CMS. And if therefore IT are pushing on that, we can say maybe they can sit together. In fact, maybe you have a traditional JSON based or Markdown based headless CMS sitting next to a more sophisticated architecture using DITA for some of the more technical requirements of our content. And while we're in there, maybe we can explore a little bit of a plug for some of our technology, but where we're enhancing that, and certainly within the AEM space, we talked about taxonomy and the need for that. And yes, there is definitely a need for a separate architecture or separate system, I should say, to manage our taxonomy. And if you're using Pool Party, you can share that taxonomy with your AEM sites and AEM guides architecture and system using Semantic Booster. Allows you to pull that in and take advantage of the power of polyhierarchical taxonomy terms and synonyms and being using that to increase your search and capability, and use that same taxonomy in other systems like SharePoint or other platforms like SAP, for instance. And indeed, if you are using AEM guides, you might also be needing something very specific for your engineering and your field engineers and content as a service to perhaps have a dedicated mobile app, which goes beyond what might be normally available on your website. And in that case, you might want something like Cogility, which is one of our products, and there are other tools for sure out there. But this is really taking the power of a very capable, dedicated system for doing something specific, but taking the power of that XML, DITA, semantic rich content in AEM guides and publishing it to other channels. And therefore, our omni-channel architecture is starting to blossom. So let's get back to some of those other DITA concepts that perhaps some of us are challenged in when we describe them. And one of those is information architecture. We'll definitely hear people talk about this. If you're implementing DITA, it's likely that your consultant, and certainly if you're working with Mekon, will be saying to you, you need to think about your information architecture. And you might well then say, well, what is that and why do I need it? Well, the thing about DITA is it is very extensive, and therefore you need to refine and tune and focus what you're doing. Much like when you're building a house. If you wanted to build a house, you don't just go and get a load of concrete blocks like JSON blocks or blocks in your headless CMS and just put them together and hope that it builds a house. You're going to think about what your requirement is. And the nice thing about DITA is there are many, many options. You might have concrete forms, SIPs, you might have cavity wall insulation, you might have concrete blocks and facing bricks. All of these types of building materials are available within your DITA architecture. And you then choose the most appropriate. And then you think about how you're going to use this information. You think about how you're going to live in the house. Who's going to live in the house? Do you need bathrooms? Do you need kitchens? Do you need a corridor from one room to another? These are all notions that you would think of if you were going to build a building of some description. And this is no different from thinking about your life cycle of content in terms of your content output going to various other forms, whether that be, as I say, an omni-channel. You need to be thinking about that delivery before you create the content to make sure it has the right semantics and therefore it's fit for purpose. And so creating an information architecture is one of the first foundation blocks, and creating that blueprint will be able to set you how you're going to move forward. But what about keys and maps? Well, I'm going to invite you to come up with some ideas as well and put them in the chat. Keys are quite an extensive and one of the more complicated things for people to get their head around within DITA. And I'd like to hear your ideas of what analogy you might use to describe a key. And also maps. I mean, people say, oh, well, you could say a map is like a map. Well, that's true, although a map doesn't really, like a geographic map, doesn't really explain a map in DITA. It's more of a container, okay? So we need a good analogy for that. And actually, a recipe is probably a better way to describe that. But in fact, a recipe has steps, and so that's not strictly what a map is. And so it's more like the table of contents and an index or a glossary, in fact, that says these are the pieces that make up my story. And therefore, these are all the components, and then that's how we're going to publish it. So maybe that's better. But I'd like to hear your ideas. I'd like to hear the chat. Do send them forward and let me know. What about specialization? This is a bit of a dirty word in many consultant areas that I hear about. Quite a lot of DITA specialists will say, no, we don't like to specialize. We like to say out of the box. It's clean, it's good. Yeah, I think that's a bit unfair. I mean, one of the things about DITA is it has this specialization capability. And so I don't think we should be scared of it, but we should also be mindful of not going mad. If you're going back to the building analogy, if you want something custom, it's going to cost you more. If you can have something off the shelf, it's going to be quicker and easier. But sometimes you really do need that custom thing. Maybe it's special thresholds to allow you to get your wheelchair in. And that customization makes it more usable for you. Well, if that's what you need, then that's what you have. And the good thing about DITA is it allows you to have that. So here's a real example of a specialization we did for IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards. And I won't go into the detail of this because it might take a little bit too long, but the principle is that they have a paragraph, which normally we think of a paragraph as like a P, and therefore it's one piece. But actually they have a paragraph which is a collection of information, and that's how they communicate it. So we created a specialization for them. And we can come back to the Lego here and say, just think of it as taking the same specification so that it still has the little bumps you can see on the top of that window, but it actually has a different form, it has a different shape, it has a different purpose, and therefore it can be plugged into all of the other pieces of our collection of Lego pieces, but it can help tell a different story. And I think that therefore is quite a nice way to illustrate it. So don't be scared of specialization, but be careful not to go mad. A bit like reuse. You do not want to be reusing down to the tiny little elements, but equally, the power of that might be that you do want to be able to reuse to some level. We have had customers where they've over reused, and now in their re-evaluation, maybe 4 or 5 years later, they're reducing the amount of reuse. They're reducing the amount of specialization, and that's because they're learning more about it. So, that might be good. So in summary, well, DITA, sadly, is not as cool as JSON. It doesn't sound as cool, does it? To say, hey, I do JSON, does sound quite nice. Whereas DITA sounds a little bit more harsh. And actually, we have another problem because people don't always know what to call it, because some people call it DITA and some people call it DITA. So if you don't even know how to call it, then it's a bit hard to know how to communicate that in a good way. And XML certainly is a scary space, and it does blow people's mind. Certainly managers are going to be scared of that, and developers go, oh no, it's old hat. Well, it's not old hat. It's still more powerful than many of the things that are around today. And so let's still use it. And lightweight DITA, lightweight sounds a bit lightweight, doesn't it? And so it's probably being underplayed. So I think we have a branding problem. We need the marketeers to come and help us to give it some new virile kind of energy behind it to make it more interesting and fun. So we need a new name maybe for DITA. We need the content operations for the DITA world. So come up with some new ideas, give us some new names, and maybe we can re-energize it. Do contact me and send me your ideas. Post them in the chat here, and we'll see if we can pick them up today. And I'd love to hear, and I'll do a blog post and think a bit more about this. Having new analogies as well. Any other new analogies you can think of when you're explaining DITA and your business process, I'd love to hear them. and it will really help us to share those ideas so that we can communicate this amazing power that we have in DITA in a new, fun way. Have a great conference and enjoy the rest of the sessions that Adobe are running, and we look forward to hearing from you and engaging with you in the future.